Let's get somebody's perspective that I think might be pretty good. Joining us now is Arizona's Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, of course, a veteran Marine. Mr. Secretary of State, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great. What did you make of yesterday? Did the Democrats do anything wrong?
No, the Democrats did the same thing my drill instructors did in Marine Corps boot camp. They told us, you're not to obey unlawful orders. It's pretty simple. I think everybody who ever wore the uniform knows that. And here's the thing that it's just, I don't understand what's going on, especially folks who have served, who know that this is true and are pretending to defend this kind of thing or discount it or laugh it off as if it's a joke. This is some serious stuff here. And particularly when you've got calls for political violence, which this is clearly, I've always condemned that. And it didn't matter where it came from. And it's not just unseemly and way beneath the office, but it's disturbing. And it's really takes us to a much darker place than I think we've been in before in this country.
I think the Democrats are too vague. I still don't know what they're necessarily talking about. What are they warning about Trump giving illegal orders? Is it the Venezuela stuff? I wish that they had come out and said, this is specifically what we're talking about.
That's not the point here. The point isn't whether or not they were talking about something specific. The point is that the president of the United States of America threatened American citizens and political opponents with death. That's not what we do in this country. That's not how you America. We're political opponents. They meet each other in political combat, which is metaphorical. And then they go on and winners win and losers try harder next time. That's the fair fight that is American politics. But, it's perfectly irrelevant what they were talking about. The reaction is really what's gotten me fired up, because at the end of the day, what if they had said, make sure your boots are really shiny, make sure that, you're snapping to attention and that you're spitting polished. I mean, make sure that you're following all lawful regulations. That's just veterans and people saying what, needs to be said. And if they were alluding to something else, maybe they were trying to bait the commander in chief, and maybe he took the bait hook, line, and sinker and reacted the way someone who might be planning on giving illegal orders would react. I mean, maybe that's what's happening here.
We're talking right now to Adrian Fontes, Arizona's Secretary of State, about the president using words like traitor and hanging. And I'm curious, you said they may have been, baiting the president, took the bait. But on a larger scale, what does this type of rhetoric signal to you about national security and stability?
Well, there's a lot of instability coming out of the White House right now because no sane person of any rank in this country ought to be asking for or threatening that folks should be obeying unlawful orders. Let's be very, very clear about this. The statements that were made about were very, very true. They were very direct, and they spoke to the idea of the rule of law. The rule of law is what's important here, not the political players, not the political fight. It is the rule of law. And when that gets challenged, when that gets threatened, because that was what was being threatened here, the very core principle, the rule of law, is what was threatened here. That's what we need to be focused on. All of the rest of it is distraction.
If there's like a military member and they're wondering what they're doing, is it legal? Is it illegal? Isn't that hard to decipher? I mean, if the president tells the generals this is what we're doing, and it's not so obvious, like, okay, why don't you shoot into a crowd of unarmed people? Well, I think, a reasonable person would say, well, I'm not going to do that. But some of these other orders, we'll do an example. What's happening in Venezuela? We're bombing boats. I don't know who these people are. I don't think anybody knows who these people are. How does a member of the military say, oh, well, obviously they've got all these drugs on board, and so I'm going to push the little button and I'm going to bomb these guys?
Look, that's, again, not the point. The point here is that the rule of law was being threatened by the president of the United States. And yeah, it's not supposed to be easy. Serving in the military is not supposed to be easy.
Right.
Decisions are not supposed to be easy. It is a little cloudy, and that's okay. The real question here is whether or not we believe in the rule of law over the whim of an individual. It's very simple. And that is not a political question. That is not a left versus right question. That is not a Republican versus Democrat question. That is not a military versus civilian question. The question is whether we support the rule of law or whether we call lawful acts seditious. That's really the question here. Because if we're going so far as to say, well, if you don't do what I say, you're committing treason or sedition, the rule of law is done. It's gone. And that means not a single one of us is safe. Nobody gets due process. Nobody has constitutional guarantees anymore. And that's what's got me fired up and worried, because some people are saying whatever the president says is legal. Would they have said that about a different president? Oh, I don't know, 1 or 2 presidents ago? That's the point here. You don't just do what the president says if it's unlawful. You don't just do what your captain says if it's unlawful. The point is the rule of law applies across the board, not just in the civilian world, but in the military world and in military service. And even in the military, there's a uniform code of military justice, which is the law that governs your activity as a member of the military. But there are still tribunals, there are still courts martial where the accused has rights. The rule of law is pervasive. It is at the core of our ethos. And when that gets threatened, that's a real problem for America.
We're talking to Adrian Fontes here, Arizona Secretary of State, and you keep talking about the rule of law. As a Marine, that is something that is very understandable to you. But how do statements like what the president made affect public's understanding of the rule of law, especially in a moment when trust in this country is very fragile?
Well, trust in this country is fragile because there's some people who are willing to cross lines. Let me just be really, really clear. If somebody tells you you can break the law if I tell you to, you know in your core, you know in your heart of hearts that that's wrong. If somebody says you can break the law if I tell you to, you know that's wrong. That violates the rule of law. So when 6 or I don't know however many people in Washington, D.C. say you can disobey unlawful orders, that's the same thing. You have to follow the law. But when somebody else says, oh, no. If I tell you to do it, even if it's illegal, it's okay. And don't listen to them. That's treason. Come on. Like, how can this be more obvious? This is not rocket science here. We have rules. No person is above the law in this society. No person, including the President of the United States of America. It cannot be more cut and dry than that. Not in the time of war, not in a time of peace. This is, again, at the core of the American ethos is the rule of law. That's why we have rules. That's why we have process. That's why we have procedures that people can depend on. And let me just make this point, because I think this is really important for folks to realize.
Okay.
The fact that we have the rule of law means that the world we live in is predictable. And that's good for business. That's good for medicine. That's good for education. That's good for regular people out there on the street. You're not to get mistreated. There is a process that all of these things flow through. We know when elections are going to happen. We know there are rules to follow there. We know that when you're driving down a highway, we have faith that everybody's going to be following the rules. This is the very core of who we are. And for someone to say, oh, no, but if I tell you to break the rules, it's okay, that's a real problem.
All right. Adrian Fontes, Arizona's Secretary of State. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Interesting conversation.
Very interesting there. Just to have it like broken down, because again, as a layman, someone who's never been in the military, I mean, it makes sense, but for him to explain it that way and the rule of law too, everyone's following the directions, like when you're driving and the laws when you're driving, it's just something so basic as that, knowing when elections are going to take place and our economy depends on that. It makes sense. And it also goes to show how scary this week has been. Yeah.
And I mean, he mentioned the Democrats baited Trump, no doubt about it. And he took the bait. And I don't know if they thought, he'll call for our lives. I don't know if they thought that, but they definitely poked the president on purpose. I mean, that's obvious. But, what the president said. By the way, you can't you can't hang Senator Kelly for this. If it's, from what I understand, if it's someone in the military, then you could go and talk about the death penalty.
But the fact that we're even having this conversation
look it up. I know,
is
it's crazy.
insane to me.
Right. All right.
The fact you had to look that up.
I did. I had to look it up. Well, it's weird. We're in weird times.
Thanks for watching Outspoken with Bruce and Gatos. Tap to watch more from KTAR News and click the button in the middle to subscribe.